Let's talk about commons-based peer production and virtue. This is the article by Benkler and Nissenbaum that you're reading. And you've probably run into both Benkler and Nissenbaum at some point already now. Even in this course, we've read something else by Nissenbaum. I think the commons-based peer production piece is the piece that Yochai Benkler is most closely tied with, and he's written quite a bit about this, and the Parable of the Penguin, I think, is one of the names of the articles he's written about this, and a bunch of other pieces where he talks about this, what he sees as a really important phenomenon, and I agree strongly with this. A lot of what he does is from the perspective, obviously, of law and policy, but it aligns very much with what I see as the most important aspects of networked society. There isn't a piece of society that hasn't been influenced by network technologies. But if you want to look for what I consider sort of the leading indicators or the most, the differences that make the most difference, there are these cases that he's calling commons-based peer production. So he's coming at it again from the perspective of law and law school, and this interest in kind of what is this doing to things like copyright, and in this regard he's kind of a fellow traveler with Lawrence Lessig and others who are interested in these policy and law questions. But the broader question here is one of public virtue, even though they don't call it public virtue explicitly, I don't think anywhere in the article. But this idea of how do these systems relate to virtuous individuals and virtuous societies. And in that piece, the virtue piece is probably more Nissenbaum's jam, right? That's kind of her thing. She's generally looking at issues of privacy, but in this case, she's kind of combining her thoughts about virtue-based approaches to Benkler's ideas around commons-based peer production. I also suspect that she contributed to the writing. To those of you who've read Benkler before, he writes like a lawyer, which is probably an insult that you wouldn't want to wish on your worst enemy. I actually like his writing, to be honest. I like kind of the way he presents a structured argument. But I have heard from now almost a generation of students that they don't like to read his work. And I don't think that's the case here. I think that they make a good writing pair here. So to start with, in case you're not familiar, commons-based peer production, what is that? Basically, it is a bunch of people working on stuff together that they then put out as something into the commons, right? Into something that the commons refers back to kind of an old idea of largely things like grazing grounds, right? That it's something that is not held by any individual, but it's a public space. Now, obviously, we're starting to get into the relationship with publics by thinking about this as a public space. He gives a bunch of examples, the ones that he often hits on elsewhere, which are things like building open source software, in particular things like Linux, right, an operating system, or the Apache web server. These are large-scale projects that a lot of people contribute to without being paid for, and then that they become part of the commons that anyone can use. Along the Wikipedia is another example, the one that I often go to, and because a lot of people, despite the fact that you're probably using some piece of open source software right now, you probably don't really think that much about it. I suspect that students do think a bit about using Wikipedia, and so Wikipedia is another one of those great examples. He hits on a bunch of different systems, including that kind of build of collaborative filtering systems, starting with Slashdot and moving on to Corrosion and all the way up through Reddit. I think that's kind of a stream that builds in that direction. And so I think those are also, not as obvious or strong a connection, because collaborative filtering doesn't feel as much like a commons as a product. And along the way, he touches on one that is probably leans towards the easiest understanding, which is this idea of barn raising, right? That people, particularly people who would have other commons-based approaches. Now when we think of barn raising, we think probably of Shakers or Quakers, because the individuation of work, the specialization means that If you're going to buy a barn now, you're probably going to hire someone to build it, right? But when communities built barns, you didn't necessarily, you couldn't rent a crane to come stand it up, so you just have everybody work together on this, and they would pitch in with the assumption that someday they too would need help from the community. So this was kind of a community resource. The commons weren't just the fields that people grazed on, but also this ability to access a group of people that could work on something. So he says, okay, so here are some examples. He runs through a bunch of examples. He says, what are some common attributes of these examples? And he notes that they tend to be modular, granular, and that there's some mechanism that kind of ties them back together again, so that you can. This is for the kinds of things that he's talking about. They're things that can be split up, finely sliced, and then they can be reunited. So something like a system that allows for integrating small changes is essential to this. So for Wikipedia, you couldn't have Wikipedia if not for the wiki, right? The wiki gives you the history, the ability to revert changes, the ability to kind of look at the changes over time. Versioning systems for software development, something like Git, are another example of a system that ties together these little changes and allows you to kind of do so in fairly complicated ways without having this gets a little bit off here, because there really are people who own certain Wikipedia pages and watch them. There are owners of certain open source projects, but generally speaking, that doesn't become, the management of this process isn't a whole other layer of work. It's something that can be handled pretty easily given those technologies that unite these little pieces together. So he argues, for example, that you can't have it's unlikely that you'd have a peer produced novel, right? It's just kind of an interesting example there, because this idea of whatever. There is the idea of building a story together is a very old game that goes back to Victorian days, right? But he says that, that doesn't come together because it's a single narrative. It's really hard to have it come together that way. I was part of a project that tried to do this for a film script, and it never really materialized because, when you have a million people write a script, it's really obvious that when you have two people write a script, it's sometimes obvious that two people have written the script instead of a single person. And so, some of these things aren't easy to split apart, finely slice, and then put back together again. I think that process, I'm old enough that when people were studying computer science at some point, that idea of computing analysis, of breaking something down into its constituent parts, was pretty essential, and especially for sort of object-oriented programming now, that idea of being able to have standalone pieces that can then integrate with other pieces. Sort of think about it as kind of the Lego approach to programming, right? Not logo, but Lego. You have all these different bricks, and they just kind of fit together really neatly, and you know that they're going to kind of fit together. As long as you put them together in the right arrangements, you end up with something. That approach, which has been used in computing and programming for a while now, is finding its way into other places. It's certainly true for things like architecture and other kinds of problems. And so that design-oriented thinking that is around splitting things into finely sliced pieces that can then be assigned and brought back together again, along with a lot of these technologies for versioning, for managing workers that are doing little things on their own and bringing them back together again. Some of you may have kind of been in a space, it tends still to be programming type spaces, but these kinds of approaches that allow for people to kind of meet together, gather together who's working on what, pick out things so that you eliminate redundancies, but then integrate those back into the larger task. Either Kanban or a whole range of different approaches to this. Scrum, you may have kind of encountered Scrum at some point, depending on the kind of work you do. These managerial approaches kind of fit into that process as well. Anyway, he says this whole cluster of commons-based peer production type projects are virtuous. And I think they do a bit of a shrug here where they say, when we talk about virtue, we're not talking about specific kinds of virtues. We're not going to list the virtues. We're not actually going to provide a very good analytical view of what they mean by virtuous. Now, on the one hand, I think that's great because for me, a lot of the philosophy around both ethics and virtue are really hard for me to grasp. That's just a personal faulting. So I don't mind that they shrug a bit, but it does feel a bit like a shrug. What they do say is that there are clusters of things that most virtue-based philosophers would consider virtuous. There are kind of clusters of these things that run commonly, without getting into the details, across anyone who uses the word virtue. And this isn't limited to the Western tradition, the Aristotelian tradition. That this, you can find the basis of this in different philosophical traditions from around the world. So they kind of say, they've split these into a bunch of different clusters. This idea of autonomy, liberty, whatever, being able to do your own thing. This kind of cluster around creativity. This cluster around friendship or camaraderie. Actually, we've just done liberté, fraternité, égalité, maybe. I don't know. But these kinds of general feel-good, virtuous things seem to be much more common among these commons-based peer productions, right? These structures. They also tend not to be tied into the price system. They tend not to be tied into the market system. Where greed is good, right? So you might actually consider, traditional capitalist approaches, market-based pricing and that sort of thing, to be a much more, Hobbesian view that it's managing the sort of negative outcomes that would happen otherwise, so that it doesn't actually encourage virtue, that there's nothing virtuous about being engaged in a market-based system, right? I mean, they don't say that explicitly, but that's kind of the subtext here, because they're saying that these approaches, which are people contributing, coming together, being creative and participating in the way they want to, all of these are fairly virtuous. Oh, and by the way, none of them have to do with the market system, right? And then they say, okay, so if we have these approaches and we agree that they're virtuous, that they have these attributes that seem to be fairly widely embraced as being virtuous, then why don't we take the next step? And although they say it's the argument, I don't think it's an argument so much as it's a suggestion, a hypothesis that they haven't really shown to be the case, but it is what they set out to be their thesis, right? Which is that these are virtuous and that they encourage virtue among those who participate in them, right? So that now, are they talking about the individual? So do the individuals who participate in these projects engage in virtuous acts by participating in them? Or is it the production of this towards the commons that is, as a project, virtuous itself? I think they're talking about the former one of these. I can't think of a good example of the commons-based peer production in the way that Benkler's talking about it, that then results in evil outcomes. Offhand, I can't think of sort of an example of that. Now, there's lots of things that try to leverage some of these peer-based systems towards market-based ends. I get paid to be part of a sort of a wiki-based set of consultants who provide consulting to governments, to companies, things like that. Now I try not to, in many cases, we don't know who our client is. In some cases we do. In some cases, these are very large, evil corporations. But in that case, we're getting paid to do it. So it's not really the kinds of, participatory, virtuous behaviors that he's talking about. Or there's a very famous example of having people, having a bounty put on who could find the best place to mine for gold, right? Distributing a set of satellite-based imagery and other kinds of data to a large group of people, and then whoever found the most likely place to find gold would then get some kind of a prize. So there have been approaches that try to do that, but I don't think they fit into the way that he is describing these commons-based peer production approaches, right? So I think that's kind of the general gist of the argument. So what does this have to do with publics? Well, obviously commons-based feels very public. Hopefully you've gotten where this ties together, right? Which is that he's talking about certain kinds of processes, management, technologies that allow for this commons-based approach to work. rules-based systems, right, or technologies of participation and collaboration. And that goes all the way back to kind of what it means, what is required for a public to exist. You know, that the Habermasian public sphere doesn't exist unless it has a set of ground rules. And so he's saying, you know, maybe we have these ground rules that seem to produce virtuous citizens. And so the question is, can we leverage, instead of leveraging those for consulting to large corporations or extracting gold from mining concerns, is there a way we can leverage these same technologies to create a commons-based, which should be a public anyway, right? A commons-based approach to policy. And I don't think he kind of hammers on that so much. I think this is much more of a kind of opening the door to this question. But I think it's a really good question, which is, why is it that we, and people have talked about open source government and things like that. Why is it we can't take some of these tools that we have for Wikipedia, for Slashdot, for open source software production? Why aren't those applied more directly to questions of public governance, of public policy, where there's a desperate need for people to participate and do so in a way that they feel like they're producing something that is for the public, right? That is for that isn't for making money, but is for making people's lives better. And so wouldn't it be nice if our publics were, if the rules that our publics were based on led to more virtuous society? All right.